Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 728, and today is December 16th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I have a ton of news from the Middle East to break down on today's show. A lot of important stuff happened over the weekend, so we are going to be going through all that on today's show. Just want to give people a quick reminder to subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. It's my brand new show. Got a whole production team behind me. It's a really awesome, high-quality podcast. We'll be out with a new episode this week. Don't miss it. Subscribe. The link is the first link in the show notes page, or if you head on over to YouTube and just search Kyle Anzalone Show, you should find it there. It is the same icon as my Twitter profile, if that helps you all out. All right, let's get into the show today. We have up here first an article that I wrote for the Institute on December 15th. Israel to deploy dozens of autonomous weapon systems to the West Bank. So the Israeli Defense Forces are preparing to place dozens of weapon systems across the West Bank that can be operated automatically or remotely. According to a report from Israeli Army Radio, the Samson remote-controlled weapons station will be deployed to dozens of checkpoint settlement entrance and key patrol points. It will be the first deployment of the system that is capable of firing lethal rounds without human intervention to the West Bank. The IDF previously used the Samson system, which can fire 5.56 millimeter, 7.62 millimeter, 12.7 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 40 millimeter 50 millimeter machine gun rounds, 40 millimeter grenade launchers, and anti-tank missiles. And that had previously been deployed to the Israeli border with Gaza. So this is a pretty significant machine. It's not firing in any way non-lethal or small rounds. These are all, rifle rounds or bigger, including grenades. I mean, it's crazy to have a autonomously operated grenade or a tank missile launcher, but that is effectively what you have here. And again, coming all over the West Bank, and I'm sure a threat to many Palestinian lives. So since October 7th, Israel has conducted a large number of military operations in the West Bank, killing more than 800 Palestinians. Tel Aviv has also stepped up its expansion of Jewish settlements and the destruction of Palestinian homes in the occupied territory. The Israeli policy of increasing raids, building Israeli-only settlements, and the destruction of homes, Palestinians' homes, has led to more conflict between armed Palestinians and the occupation forces. Some Israeli officials have discussed Tel Aviv moving to annex the West Bank during the upcoming Donald Trump administration. So this is Israeli financier Bezalel Smotrich. He said, the year 2025 will be, with God's help, the year of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, which are the Israeli words for the West Bank. He added that he had no doubt that President Trump, who showed courage and determination in his decisions during his first administration, will support the state of Israel in this move. Let's hope he's wrong, but I do think he's likely right. And this article is getting a lot of attention on Twitter, which is great to see. I always appreciate when people share my work, and it's especially horrifying to have an autonomous system with such lethal rounds that are now going to be pointed at so many Palestinians just trying to go about their daily lives in the West Bank. Will now be subject to potentially being killed by an Israeli robot, either operated by some human in some screen somewhere else or just completely autonomous. All right, next up here, this one from the Gaza Strip, Dave DeCamp, December 15th, antiwar.com. Israeli attack on school turned shelter in southern Gaza kills 20. So on Sunday night, an Israeli strike on a school sheltering displaced people in southern Gaza killed at least 20 Palestinians, including children, as the daily U.S.-backed slaughter continues. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, the strike hit a UN-run school in the western Khan Yunis near the Nasser Medical Complex. The breakdown of the casualties is unclear, but photos and videos of their aftermath show children among the dead and wounded. So Israeli forces also attacked a school sheltering Palestinians in northern Gaza, killing at least 15. Among the dead was a family of 4, including 2 children. The city has been under a total Israeli siege since early October as a part of the ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza. Israeli strikes also targeted central Gaza's Nusra refugee camp, killing a journalist and 5 civil defense workers. According to Al Jazeera, the strike targeted the headquarters of the local civilian defense rescue workers. And so this is essentially like bombing your local firehouse, right? These are the people that come when your house collapses from an Israeli strike and your children are screaming under the rubble. These are the people that come to help you, and Israel just blew them up. They dropped a bomb intentionally on them. I can't imagine what would happen in any community in the United States of America if, let's say, some Muslim terrorist planted a bomb and blew up the local fire station. I mean, the outrage, the demand for bloodlust, the amount of people who would be willing to take up arms and go to the Middle East to fight that war would be unimaginable. So I can only imagine what kind of impact this is happening in Gaza, where it's happening day after day after day after day after day. And at least, let's say this happened in the United States and the local fire department was blown up. Well, fortunately, at least here, most of the time there are a lot of other fire stations that are in the general vicinity. And so it may not be a good thing, but generally speaking, EMTs will be able to get to the site, and that there will probably be coverage, from fire departments, from ambulance services in the area where the exploded fire station blew up, where in Gaza, that's not the case. When we blow up, when the US and Israel blow up one of these facilities, it just means there's no more civil defense workers in those areas a lot of time. So the journalist who was killed, Ahmed Al-Law, a cameraman for Al Jazeera, was killed while wearing a press vest and helmet. The report said he was the 3rd journalist to be killed over the past 24 hours. According to Gaza's media office, the death of the journalist brought the total number of journalists killed by Israel in Gaza since October 7th to 196. And so that number has slowed down quite a bit, but that's not out of Israel being more careful about targeting journalists. It's just the fact that there are only 2 million people there in the first place. They've already killed 200 of their journalists, and so there's just less journalists to murder at this point. Also, many of the journalists might have left Gaza out of fear for their own lives, or maybe they, stopped reporting, and so Israel isn't targeting them that way, or they've lost their journalistic equipment, their cameras, their access to the internet, their ability to communicate with sources outside of Gaza, which, would effectively end their status as a journalist, even if it didn't end their lives. So Gaza's health ministry said in its daily death toll update, which it released about midday Gaza time, that at least 46 Palestinians were killed and another 135 wounded over the previous 24-hour period. The ministry only counts dead and wounded Palestinians brought to the hospitals and morgues. A day earlier, the health ministry reported that 55 Palestinians were killed in the 24-hour period. Israeli strikes pounded targets across the Gaza Strip, including northern Gaza, and the official death toll did cross 45,000, but we know that the death toll is far higher than that. All right, one more story on Israel here, or at least Israel's expanding borders. Israel to expand settlements in the occupied Golan Heights. So on Sunday, the Israeli government approved a plan to surge settler populations of the Israeli occupied Golan Heights, which comes after Israeli troops captured more land inside Syria following the downfall of former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The plan will spend $11 million to encourage the expansion of illegal settlements in the Golan Heights. The territory is currently populated by about 31,000 Jewish settlers and 24,000 mainly Arab Druze who consider themselves Syrians. So strengthening the Golan is strengthening the state of Israel, and is especially important at this time, Netanyahu explained. We will continue to hold on to it, cause it to blossom, and settle in it. Israel first captured the Golan Heights in 1967 and declared its sovereignty over the land in 1981, a move that was not occupied by any country until the Trump administration did so in 2019. Since Assad fled Syria and the al-Qaeda-linked HTS took over Damascus, Israel has launched hundreds of airstrikes in Syria and has taken control over the buffer zone that separated the occupied Golan Heights from the rest of Syria. Israeli troops have also invaded territory on the other side of the buffer zone and are reportedly only 15 kilometers from Damascus. The plan to expand the settlements in the Golan Heights applies only to the territory of Israel controlled before Assad's downfall, but there are signs that Israel could eventually settle into the land it recently seized, which settler groups have already had their eyes on. So the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said on Friday that Israeli troops will remain in the territory, which includes Mount Hermon, throughout the winter. Given what is happening in Syria, there is great security importance for us to remain on top of Mount Hermon, a strategic location overlooking Damascus. The U.S. has backed Israel's land grab in Syria, claiming it is a defensive action and insisting it will only be a temporary occupation, although we've seen how long other Israeli temporary occupations have lasted. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for antiwar.com on December 13th. Trump's transition team considering strikes on Iran. So strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities are being seriously considered within the Donald Trump transition team, according to the Wall Street Journal. While there is no proof Tehran is trying to make a nuclear weapon, Washington and Tel Aviv are threatening to attack Iran's nuclear energy infrastructure. So the Wall Street Journal article explained, the military strike option against nuclear facilities is now under more serious review by some members of his transition team. Iran's weakened regional position and recent revelations of Tehran's budgeting nuclear work has turbocharged sensitive internal discussions, transition officials said. So Tel Aviv is undergoing similar debate. This week, there was a report in the Times of Israel that said the Israeli Defense Forces believe that following the weakening of Iranian proxy groups in the Middle East and the dramatic fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, there is an opportunity to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. The report added that the Israeli Air Force has therefore continued to increase its readiness and preparedness for such strikes on Iran. And so I want to bring this up because, I think that the American people are often bait and switched by Washington and Tel Aviv in how they approach the Middle East. And so we'll say that, we need to wage this dirty war in Syria. We need these sanctions on Syria. We need to occupy Syria. We need to allow Israel to attack Syria, right? And we've been saying this to the American people for decades and decades and decades. And it was about protecting Israel from Iran. They said there was this evil Shiite crescent where, because the U.S. fought the Iraq War and won it for the Shiites, that if you look at Iran as a Shiite nation, then Iraq, and then Syria and Damascus was ruled by Bashar al-Assad, and Alawite, who had in his family as their rule in Syria had always been allied with Iran, and then Hezbollah, the Shiite group in southern Lebanon. And so this was, we had to worry about, we had to break the Shiite crescent to defend Israel. Okay. But then once the Shiite crescent is broken, there's no declaration that Israel is now safe. We achieved our policy. No. The response is, now we get to attack Iran. And so was it ever about breaking the Shiite crescent? Was it ever about protecting Israel? Or was it about creating a situation that would allow Israel, would allow the United States to attack Iran without Iran, having quite as many allies in the region? And I think that's really what it's all about. Israel wants to be able to do whatever it wants. Ethnic cleansing of Gaza, the annexation of the West Bank, seizing Syrian territory, the Golan Heights and beyond, maybe even southern Lebanon, are all in the eyes of top officials in Tel Aviv. Well, if you have Arab states around you that are independent or who are somewhat sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, well, then they might stand up to you in what you're doing. And so I don't think it was really even about breaking the Shiite crescent. It was just breaking another state that was independent of the Washington Israeli-led order of the Middle East, and that cannot be tolerated. You either have to be bought and paid for by the Americans or have a completely destroyed state. So the two options of the past are, being Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, where they're completely relying on the US for their military, and therefore we know that they're not going to attack Israel. Or you're going to be Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia, Libya, and have a completely destroyed and a failed state. And so this is essentially what they're saying, that they've now broken all the other states. There's no one left to stand up to the Israelis except the Iranians. And so that is where Washington and Tel Aviv are shifting their eyes. So back to my article here. According to the Wall Street Journal, President-elect Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently discussed the potential for attacking Iran. Trump has told Netanyahu in his recent calls that he is concerned about Iranian nuclear breakout on his watch. The president-elect wants plans to stop short of igniting a new war, particularly one that could pull in the U.S. military. And so it seems that while Trump's transition team is openly discussing the strikes, that Trump is more right now, his thinking seems to be, we either give Israel the military technology to carry out the strikes on their own, or we put so much military force in the Middle East that Tehran is intimidated and they make concessions at the negotiating table. I think going down either of those routes is likely to drag the Americans into a direct war with Iran, however. So whichever option Trump chooses, he is also expected to increase sanctions on Iran, given his belief that the U.S. must cripple Tehran economically. And so I think this presents another problem for Trump's policy, or the plan here, to do something short of igniting a direct war with Iran, because we know those sanctions are never going to come off. And so Iran isn't going to come to the table diplomatically and make a deal with Trump, because the threat of sanctions is there, because we're threatening to destroy the Iranian economy. And no matter how many concessions that Iran makes to the U.S., there's always going to be more demands from Washington and Tel Aviv. And I think the Ayatollah now understands that. And so I don't think a deal is likely. And if they're pushing this route, eventually they're going to end up at a place where either them or Israel attack Iran, and then all bets are off as far as the U.S.-Iran war in the Middle East. So while the U.S. intelligence community, the IAEA, that's the International Nuclear Watchdog, the Pentagon, and Iran all say that Tehran is not developing nuclear weapons, the incoming Trump administration and Tel Aviv say they are concerned about the Islamic Republic attaining a nuke. Additionally, Trump believes that Tehran was behind assassination attempts on his life. And while I think that is a lie, it's important that we understand that the president-elect believes that, because I think that could really drive some of his policy and thinking on the issue if he thinks that the Iranians are trying to kill him. So, however, Trump and Netanyahu may perceive Iran as weak, given Bashar al-Assad's ouster in Syria and Hezbollah concessions in its truth with Israel, and emboldened by recent events, Washington and Tel Aviv could strike Iran, believing Tehran is vulnerable. Mark Dubowitz, the chief executive of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, told the Wall Street Journal, if you are ever actually going to do something to neutralize the nuclear weapons program, this would be it. So on Wednesday, Netanyahu published a video on X in English telling the Iranian people that regime change may come a lot sooner than people think. And we talked about that video last week on this show. Now, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp. Netanyahu says he had a friendly conversation with Trump about achieving victory against Iran. So on Sunday, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that he spoke with President-elect Trump about Israel's need to achieve victory against Iran and its allies in the region. He said, I unequivocally declare Hezbollah and Iran in order to prevent you from attacking us. We will continue to take action against you as necessary in every arena and at all times. I discussed all of this last night with my friend, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. We had a very friendly, warm, and important discussion. We discussed the need to complete Israel's victory, and we spoke at length about efforts we are making to free our hostages, the Prime Minister added. And I wish somebody within the Trump team was sitting there reminding him that after Biden won the 2020 election, that Netanyahu was one of, if not the first international leader to call and congratulate President Biden on his election victory. And, the American election was still under some dispute in the U.S. At least, quite a few people felt that way. So I don't think that Trump appreciated that. And I hope that people remind Trump exactly what kind of friend that Benjamin Netanyahu can be. So the conversation between Netanyahu and Trump came after reports that said Israel sees an opportunity to bomb Iran following the regime change in Syria that ousted Assad. The Wall Street Journal reported that the Trump transition team is also discussing the idea of striking Iran's nuclear facilities. The pretext for any Israeli or U.S. action against Iran's nuclear facilities would be to stop Iran from building a nuclear bomb, but there's no evidence that Tehran has decided to pursue nuclear weapons, something recently acknowledged by the CIA. In his remarks on Sunday, Netanyahu said Israel was changing the face of the Middle East, noting Syria is not the same Syria, Lebanon is not the same Lebanon, Gaza is not the same Gaza, and at the head of the axis, Iran is not the same Iran. It might also feel the might of our arm. The Israeli leader claimed that Israel has no interest in conflict with Syria, but has unleashed a massive airstrike over the country, bombing it 800 times just since Assad's been out of office this past week. So, next up here, this one from Jason Ditz, antiwar.com, December 13th. Despite talk of nuclear leap, little about Iran's enrichment program has changed. And so Jason explains, this week, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, offered its latest assessment to member states about the status of Iran's civilian nuclear energy program, including its enrichment of uranium. As usual, aspects of the assessment were quickly leaked, and panic about Iran's intentions reemerged. Iran has been improving its centrifuges and has been very public about replacing old versions with newer versions and more efficient centrifuges. Indeed, the increased rate of enrichment that was a main take of the secret assessment was already coming when Iran announced new centrifuges and intended to stall weeks before. That did not stop the predictable parties from freaking out about the already announced change. Indeed, the media has been spinning the latest report as detailing a nuclear leap by Iran. Newsweek even declared Iran was increasing its enrichment of uranium to 60%. In reality, Iran has been reaching to 60% since April of 2021. Their amount of 60% uranium has grown since then. Of course, since the U.S. breaking of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal has prevented them from shipping the enriched uranium overseas for further processing into civilian fuel. Without the JCPOA, the stockpile keeps growing, and Hawk present the growth as vindication of dishonoring the JCPOA and calls for yet more to antagonize Iran. Iran recently promised that it would not enrich beyond the 16% level. Today, it was followed with a report that Iran had agreed to allow the IAEA to conduct increased monitoring at the Fordow uranium enrichment site. Either way, 60% enriched uranium is not weapons grade, which is over 90%. The media reports suggest Iran is getting closer to weapons grade, but 60% is not closer to 90% today than it was in 2021. Either way, Iran has not attempted to produce a nuclear weapon at any time in that period, and there is no evidence that has changed. Israeli officials are suggesting Iran might conceivably try to produce nuclear weapons after the regime change in Syria. Some are following this train of thought to call for attacks on Iran, which will, of course, be a major and problematic escalation. So the accusations against Iran, though, aren't materially different from what Israel has been saying for decades. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been pursuing the narrative of an Iranian nuclear threat since his first term in office in the 1990s. Tying it to the Syrian regime is a new twist, but at its core, the claims are speculation about what Iran might do in the future and aren't corroborated by any nuclear activities supported by the IAEA assessment. It's just a continuation of the multi-decade Israeli ambitions to start a war against Iran by hook or by crook. It's not just Israel either. U.S. Hoffs had talked up the idea repeatedly during that time. Even now, President-elect Trump's transition team is discussing the possibility of striking Iran. All right, few articles here on Syria before we wrap it up. Blinken confirms that the U.S. is in direct contact with al-Qaeda. So, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Saturday that the U.S. has been in direct contact with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a U.S. designated terrorist organization that grew out of al-Qaeda in Syria and recently led the offensive to overthrow former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. So, Blinken said on Saturday, yes, we have been in contact with HTS and with other parties. Our message to the Syrian people is this: we want them to succeed and we are prepared to help them to do so. Kind of funny that you want people to succeed and saddle them with al-Qaeda as their rulers. HTS and its leader, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, are overseeing a new transitional government in Syria. Blinken and other officials have celebrated the ouster of Assad and made it clear that they're willing to work with Jolani despite his past as an ISIS and al-Qaeda leader. Jolani, who has been going by his real name, Ahmed al-Shara, has been presenting himself as a moderate in an effort to gain support from the West and rebranding his campaign in 2016 by claiming his former group, the Al-Nusra Front, was cutting ties with al-Qaeda. At the time, he thanked the commanders of al-Qaeda for having understood the need to break ties. And so, as I said on the show last week, that Jolani's break from al-Qaeda was done in coordination with al-Qaeda, right? So this was rebranding in coordination with the al-Qaeda leadership. This wasn't a change in philosophy, religious views, policy, or anything like that. It was just an understanding that if he broke official ties with al-Qaeda, that he could eventually bribe himself into the good graces of the Americans, which he was able to do 8 years later. And probably, more so through that time. I think Karen Kukowski had a great line about Jolani and the Al-Nusra Front, or HTS, on Judge Napolitano's show last week, explaining that Jolani and his group are nothing more than Al-Qaeda in a suit. So in 2017, Jolani merged his group with several other Islamist factions to form HTS, which the U.S. designated as a terrorist organization in 2018. The U.S. also placed a $10 million bounty on Jolani's head. The Biden administration is reportedly considering removing the terror designation from HTS, which will allow the U.S. to provide significant aid to an HTS-led government. Blinken released a statement a few days ago, which outlined the conditions for U.S. support. Blinken said the United States reaffirms its support for Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition. The transition process should lead to a credible, inclusive, and non-sectarian governance that meets international standards of transparency and accountability. So while the U.S. is flexible with HTS's designation, it frequently points to terror designation of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah to justify the Israeli slaughter of a huge number of civilians. And so, terrorist is just a label that we put on people that we want bombed and killed. It really doesn't have anything to do with if they're likely to come here and kill Americans, because if so, there would be no discussion about removing HTS or Al-Qaeda in Syria from the terror list. All right, next up here, another one from our friend Dave DeCamp. Israel launches dozens more airstrikes in Syria. HTS says it doesn't want conflict. So Israel launched dozens of airstrikes in Syria overnight, Saturday into Sunday, despite the new de facto leader of the country, Jolani, saying that his group HTS was not interested in conflict with Israel. According to Al Jazeera, Israeli warplanes carried out about 60 strikes on Syria within 5 hours, bringing the total number of Israeli strikes since the downfall of former President Bashar al-Assad to 800. Before Israel carried out its latest round of strikes, Jolani, who has been going by his real name, al-Sharara, criticized Israel's recent actions but said he didn't want to fight. He said, "We are not about to engage in conflict with Israel. Jolani explained. He said that Israel's arguments for attacking Syria no longer exist because Iran and Hezbollah no longer have a foothold in the country. And that was Israel's excuse, not to, agree with Jolani here, but on that particular point, he is correct that if Israel was bombing Syria simply because Iran and Hezbollah were there, well, that excuse is now gone, yet Israel is bombing more than ever. So Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem acknowledged Sunday that the Lebanese group lost its supply lines in Syria due to the regime change. He said, yes, Hezbollah lost military supply route through Syria at this stage, but this loss is a detail in the resistance's work. While celebrating the downfall of Assad, Israel also spited unspecified threats from Syria to justify its massive strikes and invasion of southern Syria. Israel has taken over a buffer zone between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and the rest of Syria and is also capturing areas beyond the buffer zone. Al-Mayadeen reported on Sunday that Israeli troops are expanding their occupation of the southwestern province of Kanara. The report said that Israeli troops are only about 15 kilometers from Damascus. And so this is a fairly significant Israeli presence in Syria. All right, next up here, the Kurds are going to get screwed again. U.S. assures Kurdish FDF after Turkish foreign minister says the goal is to wipe them out. So it has been a wild 72 hours for the Kurdish-dominated SDF in the Syria's northeast, after substantial fighting over the city of Manbij and a 4-day truce conditioned entirely on the SDF removing themselves and their families from the area. The relative stability in Syria's northeast seems more tenuous than it's been in years. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Turkey on Friday to meet with the foreign minister, the Turkish foreign minister, with the talks considerable discussions on post-Syria Assad. So just hours later, the Turkish foreign minister made a live TV broadcast in which he declared that Turkey's strategic goal was the elimination of the YPG. The YPG is the Kurdish group, which is by far the largest component of the US-backed SDF that rules eastern Syria. So the Turkish minister's broadcast suggests that Blinken's meeting didn't go well, at least as far as the SDF would be concerned. Since that Friday meeting and broadcast, though, U.S. officials have continuous talks with the SDF, trying to reassure them that they really don't face an existential threat from Turkey and its allies. And of course, Turkey's allies include the United States of America, as Turkey is a NATO country. That's clearly a reassurance that the SDF would desperately need after not just the foreign minister's broadcast, but consistent fighting with the new Syrian government's forces since the ouster of Assad. That fighting has already apparently cost them the city of Manbij. ISIS took over Manbij in 2014, and then the SDF took the city from them, allowing the return of displaced Kurds to the city and surrounding areas. In 2016, Turkey has been trying to get the Kurds out of Manbij since 2018. This past week's ceasefire deal apparently finally accomplished that. Turkey has long had a problem with the de facto U.S. alliance with the YPG and the SDF. Turkey considers the YPG to be a direct offshoot of the PKK, a banned organization considered terrorists inside of Turkey, and the U.S. also considers the PKK a terrorist organization. The PKK and YPG do have ideological commonalities, and there is a relationship, but many have said that Turkey overstates how close the two actually are. Either way, it seems like the deal and evacuation of Manbij is not the end for the SDF. Despite U.S. reassurances, the U.S. reportedly has reminded the SDF that the Turkish President Erdogan and Trump are friends. Erdogan did indeed refer to Trump as his friend and embrace his re-election last month. The relationship has hardly been smooth, though. They reportedly sparred over multiple issues, according to Turkey's purchase of a Russian air defense system, and the U.S. actually under Trump, kicked Turkey out of the American F-35 program at that time. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. We will have plenty more from Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anzalone Show this week, so be sure you're subscribed to both channels, and I really appreciate all your support.